The journey began with an idea, one that no one thought would work. David had always been the underdog, the one who saw things differently, but now he had a vision that defied every norm in the corporate world. He had spent years working in the traditional business system, climbing the corporate ladder. But the more he climbed, the more he saw how broken it all was. Opportunities were reserved for the elite, and innovation was stifled by old methods and stale traditions. So, he made a decision. He would challenge the status quo, build something different, something for the everyday person. But he knew this journey wouldn't be easy. He would face rejection, opposition, and skepticism. But one thing was certain, he wasn't going to play by the rules anymore. David's vision was clear, but reality quickly set in. The path to success was far from easy. Despite his unwavering belief in his idea, people were skeptical. Investors turned him down. Competitors laughed. Even his closest friends questioned his choices. It was the most painful part of the journey, facing the doubt of others. But David had something they didn't. He had resilience. Every rejection fueled his determination to prove them wrong. He knew that to change the world, he would have to fight against the tide. It wouldn't be fast, it wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth it. Little did he know, these early moments of doubt would be the foundation for his future success. David's breakthrough came when he least expected it. He had been pitching to investors all month, but no one took him seriously. Then one afternoon he received an email from a venture capitalist, a person who had built their wealth by challenging the status quo. This was the moment David had been waiting for. The investor had seen something in him, something others didn't. They believed in his idea, not just because of the potential profits, but because they recognized the drive and passion behind it. This was the spark that ignited the next phase of David's journey. It was the turning point, the moment when everything changed. With the investor's support, David was able to launch his business. It wasn't perfect, and the challenges didn't stop. But for the first time, he felt a sense of control over his future. His first product was a hit, and slowly but surely, the company began to grow. The satisfaction wasn't just in the success. It was in proving the doubters wrong. The recognition he received wasn't just from clients. It was from the world that had told him his vision was impossible. But David knew the real work was only just beginning. The first victory was sweet, but he had his sights set on a much bigger goal, changing the entire industry. As the company grew, so did the challenges. Success brought competition, jealousy, and external pressures. But David had been through the worst, and he wasn't about to stop now. Every obstacle became an opportunity to further differentiate himself from the established powers. He had challenged the status quo before, and he would continue to do so. But this time, he was no longer fighting alone. He had a team, a vision, and a belief that the future of business would be built on transparency, innovation, and resilience. David knew the road ahead would be tough, but the reward would be worth the sacrifice. The journey had only just begun. Just as things began to look up, the first major setback hit. A key supplier canceled their contract, throwing David's entire production schedule into disarray. The failure stung more than any rejection he had faced before. It wasn't just a business hiccup. It was a direct threat to his vision. The pressure mounted as customers began asking for products they couldn't yet deliver. But David wasn't one to back down easily. He spent sleepless nights finding a solution, reaching out to new suppliers, renegotiating terms, and recalibrating his strategy. The setback became a lesson in resilience, reminding him that every challenge was an opportunity to prove that his dream was worth fighting for. David refused to let the setback define him. The next morning, he gathered his team in the conference room, explaining the situation and encouraging them to brainstorm solutions. There was no time for wallowing in defeat. They had a company to run. He spent hours on calls, reaching out to potential suppliers, using his charisma and determination to convince them that his startup was worth the risk. Slowly, new partnerships began to form. David learned the importance of adaptability in business. Success wasn't just about having the right ideas. It was about having the resilience to adapt when things went wrong. As new agreements were finalized, David could feel his momentum building again, one step at a time. As the company slowly regained its footing, a new competitor emerged in the market, one with more resources, more experience, and a stronger brand presence. It was a blow to David's growing confidence. The market was becoming saturated, and the established players were not about to let an upstart like him take over. For a moment, he wondered if it was even worth continuing. But then he remembered why he had started in the first place: to challenge the status quo, to provide something better than what the industry offered. With renewed energy, David pivoted, focusing on what made his company unique. Instead of trying to outdo the competition, he aimed to do things differently, to provide value in a way the market hadn't seen before. It was risky, but David had learned that in business, those who challenge the norm are the ones who ultimately shape the future. David's big break came when he least expected it. While attending an industry event, he struck up a conversation with a seasoned entrepreneur named Sarah, who had successfully navigated the same challenges he was facing. She was impressed by his passion and his willingness to take risks, and they quickly bonded over shared frustrations with the industry's traditional ways. Sarah offered to partner with David, providing him with the mentorship, connections, and financial backing that would allow his business to scale. It was a game-changing moment. David had finally found the ally he needed, a mentor who would not only guide him but also invest in his vision. This partnership opened doors he had only dreamed of and gave him the confidence to push forward like never before. With Sarah's mentorship and financial backing, David's business began to scale rapidly. The once small startup grew into a serious contender in the market. They expanded their product line, increased their production capabilities, and began hiring more staff. The next challenge was maintaining the quality and vision that had made his business unique in the first place. It wasn't enough to simply grow. David knew that true success came from growth that remained true to the original idea. As the company expanded, David focused on building a strong, cohesive team that shared his passion and vision. The hardest part was letting go of some responsibilities, but David knew that in order to grow, he had to trust his team and delegate. It was a moment of personal growth, learning to step back and let others take charge, all while keeping the company's core values intact. The competition was fierce. As David's company gained traction, the established players in the industry began to take notice. The market, which once seemed vast and full of opportunity, was now a battlefield. The corporate giants, sensing a threat, started to retaliate. Their tactics were harsh, cutting prices, launching smear campaigns, and trying to outbid David at every turn. The pressure mounted, but David was determined not to let his hard work be undone by their underhanded tactics. Instead of playing by their rules, he doubled down on what made his business different. He invested in customer loyalty, product quality, and the values that had set his company apart from the start. The war for success had begun, and David was ready to fight with everything he had. The first real blow came when David's main competitor launched a heavily funded marketing campaign that overshadowed his own efforts. Customers who had previously shown interest in his products were now flocking to the competition. For the first time in a long while, David felt the weight of his dreams slipping away. Sales dipped. His loyal employees began questioning whether they had made the right choice by following him. The doubts crept in, but David refused to let this setback define him. It was time to rethink the strategy, to find a way to outsmart the competition rather than outspend them. In this moment of defeat, David found the clarity he needed. It wasn't about fighting them on their terms. It was about using his creativity and authenticity to stand out. He began to build a campaign centered around the story of his journey, the struggle, the authenticity, the real connection with his customers. It wasn't just business anymore, it was personal. David spent the next few weeks pouring every ounce of energy into developing a creative campaign. He knew it wasn't going to be easy to compete with the deep pockets of the corporate giants, but he had something they didn't: his story. He began documenting his journey, from the struggles of building the business to the lessons he had learned along the way. His marketing campaign was built on authenticity, appealing to customers' emotions by showing the human side of business, the late nights, the sacrifices, and the triumphs. The message resonated with people who began to see David not just as a business owner, but as someone who genuinely cared about creating a product that made a difference. Slowly the tide began to turn. David's campaign gained momentum, and word of mouth began to spread faster than any ad campaign could. His business was growing again, fueled by passion, creativity, and the undeniable power of authenticity. The campaign hit its peak when a well-known influencer, who had followed David's journey from the beginning, decided to partner with him. The influencer shared David's story with their millions of followers, showcasing the authenticity and grit behind the business. The response was overwhelming. Sales skyrocketed as customers flocked to David's website, eager to support a brand that represented hard work, integrity, and authenticity. David's business had now become a movement, not just a company. His values resonated with people on a deeper level, and they were willing to pay a premium for the products because they felt they were investing in something real. This was David's moment of triumph. He had proven that with the right story and the right strategy, a small business could stand tall against the giants of the industry. David had done it. His business was no longer a small startup trying to make it in a tough market. It was now a recognized brand, synonymous with authenticity and resilience. But David knew that success didn't mean the battle was over. In fact, it was just the beginning. The road ahead was still filled with challenges, but David had learned that the key to lasting success was adaptability. The business world would continue to change, but as long as he stayed true to his vision and values, he could weather any storm. With a newfound sense of confidence, David began to look forward to the future, knowing that his business could survive and thrive by challenging the status quo every step of the way. As the business soared, David began to feel invincible. The success, the recognition, it all came at once, and with it, a sense of pride that clouded his judgment. He trusted his business decisions more than ever, believing the worst was behind him. But his newfound confidence led to a fatal flaw: complacency. While his competitors were evolving and adapting to market changes, David's focus shifted inward. He stopped listening to his team as closely, stopped innovating, and thought that he had cracked the code. Unfortunately, the market never stays still, and soon enough the cracks in David's strategy began to show. The product that once stood out as revolutionary started to lose its edge. Customers, no longer intrigued by the same offering, began to look elsewhere. And David was too slow to react. It didn't take long for the consequences of David's neglect to catch up with him. A large client, who had been a cornerstone of the business success, decided to drop his company for a competitor. This was the wake-up call David needed. The phone call from the client was brief, cold, and final. They no longer felt the value David's company brought to the table. It was a gut punch. David had thought he was untouchable, but this single loss pulled him back into reality. In a panic, he called his mentor Sarah to get advice. "You've built something amazing, but now you need to rebuild," she told him. "Success doesn't last unless you keep moving forward." The words stung, but they also gave David the clarity he needed. He had been resting on past achievements. Now, it was time to get to work again, starting from scratch. David spent days reflecting on where things had gone wrong. He remembered the early days when he had poured every ounce of energy into building the business, never allowing himself to be distracted or complacent. He had been motivated by a burning desire to prove something, not just to others, but to himself. But over time, that fire had dimmed. His vision had narrowed, and he had stopped thinking about the future. Instead, he had been coasting, believing the success he had achieved would carry him forward. Sitting in the quiet of his office, he realized how much he had taken for granted. He had let go of the very qualities that had made him successful: innovation, resilience, and passion. And now it was time to regain them. David knew that he couldn't just fix what was broken, he needed to reinvent his company. He called a meeting with his team, who had grown disheartened by the lack of direction. "We're not the company we were 6 months ago," David admitted. "But we don't need to be. We're going to make something better. We're going to listen to what our customers really need, not just what we think they want." With renewed clarity, he started implementing changes. The focus shifted from merely making sales to building long-term customer relationships. Product features were redesigned, new partnerships were formed, and David made a conscious effort to lead with empathy and transparency. This time, the company was going to grow not just for profit, but for purpose. With the comeback plan in place, David worked tirelessly alongside his team to rebuild the company's reputation and customer base. It wasn't easy. There were long hours, moments of doubt, and setbacks. But with each small victory, David felt the fire reignite. Slowly, the customer base began to trust him again. New business flowed in, and long-term partnerships were secured. David learned that success wasn't just about climbing to the top. It was about staying there, and knowing when to change course. The company didn't just return to its previous state, it was stronger than ever. And David? He was no longer the same person. The journey had changed him. The setbacks had shaped him. And now as he looked at his business, David realized that the true measure of success wasn't just financial, it was the resilience to keep going, no matter what. Just as things seemed to be getting back on track, a new external threat emerged. David's business, now stronger and more stable, was starting to attract attention from the wrong kind of competitors. A corporate giant, long known for their ruthless tactics, saw David's business as a threat to their market share. They launched a calculated campaign designed to undermine David's credibility, making false claims about the quality of his products and the integrity of his business. The accusations were vicious, and soon, the press and social media were flooded with negative reviews and reports. David was no stranger to setbacks, but this time, the stakes were much higher. His hard-earned reputation was on the line. The fight wasn't just about business anymore. It was personal. David sat in silence for hours, thinking about how to respond to the allegations. He had always prided himself on doing business the right way, honestly and ethically. But now, with everything on the line, the pressure mounted to fight back with fire. Some of his team members suggested he retaliate, using underhanded tactics to expose his competitors for their manipulation. Others warned him to stay true to his values, to trust that the truth would eventually prevail. The dilemma was clear: to go down the same path as his rivals, or to stand firm in his principles and face the challenge head-on. For David, the answer was clear. He had already come too far to compromise who he was. But could staying true to his values actually save his business? David decided to take a bold step. Instead of playing the game by the corporate giant's rules, he would expose their lies and manipulation in a way that aligned with his values. He launched a campaign focused not just on defending his company, but on educating the public about the ethical choices behind his business. The campaign emphasized transparency, showing the real process behind his products, sharing customer testimonials, and providing an open forum for people to voice their concerns. David didn't just want to prove his company was better, he wanted to show that doing business with integrity was the right way to win. Slowly the public began to rally around David. No. The more they saw of the behind-the-scenes truth, the more they respected his dedication to ethical business practices. The tide began to turn in his favor, but it was still a battle. As the campaign gained traction, the corporate giants began to realize they had underestimated David. Public sentiment was shifting, and their smear tactics were starting to backfire. In a last-ditch effort, they tried to push David out with a legal battle, filing frivolous lawsuits to stall his growth. But this time, David was ready. He had prepared for this moment, and instead of retreating, he used the legal battle as another platform to showcase his company's transparency and ethical practices. He won over public opinion, not just by defending his business, but by showing the world that he would never compromise on his principles. The legal battle was long, exhausting, and expensive, but in the end, it only solidified David's position as a leader in the industry. David emerged victorious from the battle, but it was the lessons he had learned along the way that mattered most. His business had grown, but more importantly, it had grown with integrity. Customers trusted him, employees felt valued, and the industry began to recognize that success could be achieved without compromising one's values. David had shown the world that it was possible to build a fortune by challenging the status quo, but not at the expense of one's ethics. As he stood in front of his team, David couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. It had been a long, difficult journey, but he had done it his way, without shortcuts, without compromise. As David's business flourished, an unexpected figure from his past reappeared: Mark, the former business partner who had betrayed him years ago. Mark had left David's company when it seemed like the business was on the verge of collapse, taking key resources and ideas with him. At the time, his departure had felt like a personal loss, and David had struggled to rebuild. But now, Mark returned, seeking to reconnect and join forces again. He claimed to have learned from his mistakes, and was eager to help David scale the business further. The question loomed: could David trust him again? Was Mark truly remorseful, or was he trying to latch onto David's success? The past and present collided as David wrestled with the idea of redemption, or revenge. David sat at his desk for hours, pondering his next move. The thought of bringing Mark back stirred a whirlwind of emotions. There was a part of him that wanted to believe Mark had truly changed, that perhaps this was a chance for redemption, for both of them. But another part, a more cautious part, whispered that Mark was only interested in profiting from the success that David had built from the ashes. David knew that this was a critical moment. If he let Mark back in and it ended badly, it could tarnish everything he'd worked for. But if he rejected Mark outright, he risked remaining shackled to the past. It was a decision that could make or break the future of the business. After days of deliberation, David finally decided to meet with Mark again. This time they spoke candidly about their past. Mark admitted his faults, acknowledging the pain he had caused, and the mistakes he made when he walked away. "I was wrong, David," Mark said, "and I've paid the price for it. But I believe in what you've built, and I want to help you reach even greater heights." David listened, torn between his lingering distrust and his belief in second chances. Mark's words seemed genuine, but David knew he had to be careful. If he allowed himself to forgive Mark, it would be an act of immense trust, but if Mark betrayed him again, it would be devastating. David decided to give Mark a chance, but he knew that trust had to be earned, not freely given. He assigned Mark a critical project, one that could either make or break their next big product launch. Mark's task was to oversee the launch of a new line, but David kept a close eye on him. Weeks passed, and Mark worked tirelessly, but David was still unsure. Was he really working for the betterment of the company, or was he simply looking for a way to make his mark on the success without truly earning it? The test of loyalty was far from over, and David knew that Mark's true colors would reveal themselves soon enough. The day of the product launch finally arrived, and the results were in. Mark had done it. The launch was a resounding success. The product was flying off the shelves, and the media was buzzing with positive reviews. It was clear that Mark's contributions had made a real difference, and David felt a momentary sense of relief. But even in his success, David couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal that still lingered. "Maybe I was wrong to doubt him," David thought, watching as Mark stood in front of the team, celebrating. But as the day went on, David realized something: true redemption wasn't about perfection. It was about the willingness to change, to grow, and to stand by your word. Mark had earned David's trust, not just with his work, but with his actions over time. As they celebrated, David knew that his decision to forgive was the right one, not because it was easy, but because it allowed both of them to move forward. As the business continued to grow, David's success started to take a toll. The demands of running a rapidly expanding company meant long hours, endless meetings, and constant stress. His personal life began to suffer. His relationship with his family was strained, and the friendships that once meant so much to him started to fade into the background. David's focus on the business had consumed him, and although he had built his fortune, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important was slipping through his fingers. Late one night, as he sat alone in his office, he received a call from his sister, reminding him of a family event he had missed yet again. The guilt hit him hard. Is this success worth losing everything else? He wondered. The question echoed in his mind as he looked at the piles of work in front of him, unsure how to balance his success with his personal happiness. The next morning, David reached out to his mentor, seeking advice. The mentor had seen many successful entrepreneurs fall into the same trap of prioritizing work over everything else. David, success can be intoxicating, but it's the relationships you nurture outside of business that truly sustain you. Don't let your ambition blind you to the people who have always had your back, the mentor advised. It was a harsh truth, but one David needed to hear. As he listened, David realized he had become so focused on achieving his goals that he had neglected the very foundation that had helped him get there: his family, friends, and the people who had believed in him from the start. It was time to reevaluate his priorities. Determined to make a change, David called a meeting with his leadership team. He had spent so much time building the business that he had lost touch with the core values that had motivated him in the first place. He stood in front of them, looking at the faces of the people who had helped him build everything, and said, "We've come a long way, but I've been so focused on growing the business that I've neglected the people who matter most. It's time to change that. We need to balance our drive for success with our responsibility to each other, our families, and our community." The team was supportive, but David knew that implementing this shift in focus would be a challenge. It would require sacrifices and tough decisions, but he was ready to take the first step. David knew that shifting his priorities meant making sacrifices. He started delegating more responsibilities to his team, giving them the freedom to lead in areas that he had once controlled tightly. At the same time, he made more time for his family and friends, rekindling relationships that had suffered during his pursuit of success. However, it wasn't easy. The demands of running a business still weighed on him, and letting go of control didn't come naturally. There were moments of doubt, and he found himself questioning if he was making the right choices. But slowly, he began to see the benefits. His family became a source of strength, his friendships deepened, and his team thrived with the autonomy he had given them. David learned that success wasn't just about the money or the accolades. It was about balance, fulfillment, and finding happiness in both work and life. Months passed, and David's life began to stabilize. The business continued to grow, but now it was in harmony with his personal life. He had found the balance he had been searching for. As he stood on the balcony of his office, overlooking the city, he reflected on how far he had come. "I built my fortune by challenging the status quo," he thought. But the real challenge was finding a way to live a life that didn't compromise the things that mattered most. David realized that the true value of his success wasn't just in the company he had built, but in the relationships he had nurtured, the lessons he had learned, and the person he had become. His journey had been one of transformation, not just in business, but in life.